Live?
Yes, we're live.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. And good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special committee of the whole meeting. Really appreciate everybody on council taking the time to have this special working session scheduled to last until 7:30. This is, of course, different than a common council meeting, even though there's all 10 of us. Committee of the whole meetings are intended to give council the space and time to work through particularly trying issues or complex issues. Seemed necessary to add one this month. As you know, last month was our common council meeting where we had a public comment period. March 24th is the city administration committee where we can dig even deeper into the report and recommendations. And then the March 31st meeting of common council, which is another opportunity to hear public feedback and for council to consider changes or amendments to the report. We're also looking to add, we'll discuss more tonight, the logistics of it, but looking to add another meeting Tuesday night, next Tuesday night, particularly because some folks thought there would be a public hearing tonight. They were prepared to speak. We want to give them an opportunity to do that. So might add a public hearing next Tuesday that we'll discuss. Don't want to conflict with the county. And yes, then there are, of course, a ton of other opportunities to share your feedback and your input. You can email council@cityofithaca.org or go through the Reimagine Public Safety web portal hosted by Tompkins County. I want to appreciate our friends and partners from Tompkins County who are here with us today, as well as city staff. And thank you all. So, of course, the report is 100+ pages with 10+ appendices. A lot to consider and a tough task for any legislative body to vote on under such a tough, short time constraint. So our feeling with our partners with the county was to simplify, to actually break it down to just have the actual recommendations themselves without the supporting materials make up the resolution. And that's the resolution that I sent to council today to kick off your discussion. Of course, free, this is council's resolution at this point, so you're free to amend, change, turn completely upside down. But you'll see the way we structured it was in order to help council make the resolution their own and the legislature make the resolution their own. There are two buckets of recommendations. And in the first bucket, you'll see the joint recommendations, all of the things that were recommended in the report jointly. An incomplete list is the evaluating existing models and implement an alternative to law enforcement response, or collect the results of officer-initiated traffic enforcement. Identify new curriculum, redesign and implement culturally responsive training. Develop a comprehensive community healing plan. Those recommendations were included as joint. Then in the next resolved, you'll see that city-specific recommendations, of which really there are two. One is to create a Department of Community Solutions and Public Safety, and the second is to grant the City of Ithaca Community Police Board more oversight authority. The resolution also makes clear in the resolved and in the description of the new department that all of the existing officers would have all of their current protections guaranteed. The current contract would port over, their current union would port over, and all of their positions, titles, if they were officers, they would continue to be officers. If they're sergeants, there would be whatever the equivalent of sergeants were. That includes their pay and their benefits. So those were included as resolves because council really made it clear, and after hearing from the officers, that was a big concern, that was a big fear, is that we would lose all of our excellent officers in any transition, and we don't want to do that. So the resolve will make that clear. That was the kicking off point. We know that there's obviously still going to be a ton of questions, which is good that we have a few more meetings to keep discussing this. The staff have been working hard to put out an FAQ, a frequently asked questions document that I believe will go out soon. Dan, if it didn't already go out this afternoon, it's possible it went out this afternoon.
Hoping this evening or tomorrow morning, Mayor.
Evening or tomorrow morning. Thank you. Which should help the public keep up with some of these fast-moving discussions and changing the changing interpretations of the report, but should make clear that the officers will retain their jobs, their job titles, and all their union protections. There is also, I was going to mention something else about public meetings. We're doing one with Calvary Baptist, right, Thursday?
That is correct. Yes, sir.
Okay. Maybe I could do a complete roundup at the end of the meeting, so I don't have to take up any more time. But we also want to let you know that we have been working hard on budget estimates, and they really are rough estimates for much of the stuff, but we wanted council and the legislature to have a picture of what can be envisioned. And so we hope to get that to you too in the next couple of days. With that, I'll just open the floor for general discussion, questions, ideas about the resolution or about the report in general. Yes, Laura.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to add my thanks to everyone who worked on this proposal. There's been hundreds of hours, perhaps thousands of hours that have gone into this proposal. And so I personally would like to express a great deal of gratitude for everyone who worked on it. It's very clear that we cannot do nothing. I understand that the proposal is a living document, and that there will be new information and revisions as we go through actually the implementation phase. I'm pleased to hear that we will have some budget information coming. Did you say within a few days or weeks?
Days. So that I sworn that it's very preliminary and sketch. Sure. Dominic and Jason, that's right. We expect in the next couple of days, right?
Yes, that is correct. We have estimates under the premise of city and county would share expenditures 50-50. But again, as a living, breathing document, as things change or they adjust, we would modify things accordingly. And then also we fully expect that there will be things that you would like us to add to or subtract. And so within I would hope tomorrow, if that's fair, to send that out, and then look forward to receiving your feedback, and we'll continue to modify. And we'd like to also thank Shelley for her work on this as well.
And could I just ask, we've received this resolution from the mayor today. And that is on our city website, will there be a similar resolution shared from the county?
Yes. Yes. I know the county legislature has a very similar resolution, with the exception of the city initiatives, I think, versus just the county initiatives, the county only ones being replaced in there. So it's a very similar format, acknowledging and recognizing the joint recommendations as well.
And we should be receiving that, be able to see that sometime soon.
Yes, I think it's today, the 10th. So next week they have their first public safety committee meeting, but once it's circulated, I'll make sure it's forwarded to the common council.
Thank you.
Deanna?
We also received an email from Cynthia as well. I wanted to elevate that as well regarding the feedback that we received from the community. And so we're in the process of trying to aggregate all the information and to put together a memo to send that out to you all as well. Because I believe it was Cynthia who sent an email earlier today to Jason and myself. And so we wanted to acknowledge that we received that as well, and we'll be getting that to you shortly. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll join Laura in, again, appreciating the work that not only went into this whole effort, but also the resolution that was sent around earlier today. I haven't had a chance to compare this to the report, but I can count, and I see that there are the number of kind of proposals. I think it's is it 16 now, and there were 19 in the original kind of report. Could you possibly, for my benefit, just summarize what was either condensed or what was changed between the two list of recommendations?
Yeah, so what we just it's just the 3 recommendations that were county only. So this is what we decided with the county, is that the city would vote on the city-only recommendations. The county would vote on the county-only recommendations.
Oh, okay.
Both vote on the joint recommendations. So there were 3 recommendations that were county only.
Yep.
In fact, slight amendment to that. There used to be 4 recommendations that were county only, But we figured, I'm talking to the leadership team with the reimagining, that the one about analyzing traffic stop data could be a joint one as well. That there was no reason that the city would not want to do that, as well as the county.
Okay, good. Thank you for that clarification.
Mhm. Yes, George.
Hi, everyone. I have a minor suggestion for an edit on one of the joint county and city proposals. It says, conduct a review of SWAT callouts, et cetera, et cetera. I think it would be more accurate if we conducted a review of CINT, C-I-N-T, and SWAT callouts, the critical incident. Forgot what NT stands for. But
Negotiating team.
yes. So I think CINT should be included in that.
I think that's a good note, and see no reason for it. Dan, is it possible for you to, because I want to be able to call on folks, is it possible for you to capture some of the notes for the?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Donna.
I sent around a lot of comments that I had worked on over the past couple of weeks. I have major objections to number 1 as it's written, and I'm sure that will come up later in conversation. I don't understand why 13 and 14 are written the way they are. They seem to be backwards. It seems to me that you would conduct a review of callouts and then decide how to redeploy the Truck 99. It doesn't make sense. I think 13 and 14 should be combined into one recommendation that would analyze the use of Truck 99 and then subsequent to that, develop a plan for possible redeployment of the vehicle. I also think that number 4 should simply be part of number 7. I mean, because traffic stop data is a really important kind of data, and number 7 deals with all kinds of data and analysis. So I think number 4 should be part of number 7, and we should include the analysis of city data in that. And I don't understand why the city is not included in number 3. Number 2 and number 3 are somewhat redundant to number 1 for the city, but that's okay. I think that the city should be included in number 3. And I have some other comments about tightening up the wording a little bit, but I won't waste time on that. So other than my comments on number 1, I think those are significant modifications I'd also like to make.
Let me make sure I've got that. You'd
Yes.
like to merge the SWAT and CINT recommendations into one, which is study the callouts and then determine what to do with the truck.
Yes.
You have to merge 3 and 7, or sorry, not 3 and 7. I already have lost the numbers, but you'd like to merge the 4 and 7. I'd like to merge the data recommendations about
Yes.
traffic stops and data more broadly.
Yes.
Got it. And then what was the last one? Number 3, why is the city not listed as number 3? So that maybe I might call on Jason to talk about why the county's experience working with a myriad of mental health agencies and social services might, see, I caught Jason eating dinner. How dare you? And might make them best suited to be the lead on number 3.
Sure, I can talk about, that's the alternative response model. So I mean, through a lot of the feedback that we received, there was a continual, both I think from the focus groups that also involved law enforcement, there was a lot of issue and concern around, law enforcement responding to a lot of different calls, a lot of them not necessarily being in the realm of law enforcement. And, through those discussions, we identified that, particularly when we talk about crisis response, we talk about mental health response, sometimes there's a better opportunity or option to have a better type of response if it's a non-law enforcement or unarmed individual. So we started to look at these different alternative response models. The CAHOOTS model, which is out of Eugene, Oregon, really started to resonate as to being able to provide an unarmed response for crisis response, for mental health response, and also provide some level of additional health and human service, social service, wraparound service. So that's really where the alternative response model came from. And obviously there's a lot of details as to how you dispatch resources adequately and sufficiently so that you aren't sending individuals into harm's way. And then it doesn't go without saying that this type of alternative response may also be done in co-response with law enforcement. Doesn't mean that it's also always going to be replacing or supplanting law enforcement from doing this in the future, because as we know, in many instances, there needs to be safety, and there needs to be ensure safety of the individual that's making the call or individuals making the call, as well as the folks responding to it. So this really fits within the health and human service realm, which is generally what, one of the areas that the county covers. And I think from a county-wide perspective, fits well in how we ensure that proper response is given to individuals, as opposed to always sending a uniformed law enforcement responder that may not be the best fit or best equipped to handle those types of calls. I hope that answers the question about alternative response, but
yeah. And I think recognizes too that the city is, of course, a part of the county. It's 1/3 of the population, and by the county taking this on, is recognizes that it's got to be one holistic answer there, which I really appreciate. Donna?
Oh, so you're saying, so my reaction to what Jason just said was, well, we want to do that in the city too. And you're saying, well, yes, the county will do that in the city.
Right.
Is that right?
I don't really know how you could do it differently
Right.
From a perspective of continuity of service. If we
Okay.
start getting into jurisdictions that don't want that response, I think that becomes very difficult. I mean, let's look at it from this way. The mobile crisis team doesn't respond to every place but the city. Mental
Right.
health services don't provide services to all these jurisdictions with the exception of this one.
Got it.
So I would envision this being a similar type of.
Okay, I understand now. So it's a county, it's part of the county plan that covers the entire county. Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I just have.
Yeah, Seth.
Sorry.
Sorry, Jason, did you have a comment?
I was just, and this may not be the right time. So if it isn't, I'll sit down. Just let me know if you want. There was some comment about why the certain order of the SWAT vehicle was done a certain way, and there was also a comment about the traffic stop. So whenever the time is, I'd be happy to engage in conversation with those particular recommendations.
Sure. Why don't you jump in now, and then we'll go to Seth. And I'll just mention again that this is a good time for council to just get the questions out, even if we can't answer them now. We can compile the questions and then get written answers in time for our next meeting. So Jason, go ahead, then.
Sure. So as we're discussing the SWAT vehicle shifting, they were not intended to be one relying on the other, meaning one would inform the other. The primary reason the SWAT vehicle was suggested of being turned over to DOER was for several reasons. One is it's a mobile communication center that has value from an emergency response perspective, not just from a law enforcement response perspective. It's a vehicle that has caused trauma, in the community, and having the vehicle as an asset accessible to more emergency response alternatives or more emergency response needs other than just law enforcement was obvious in that process. So shifting it over really wasn't dependent upon the following recommendation. The following recommendation was really about assessing SWAT callouts. George's recommendation is good with respect to SIN callouts as well, and assessing, was it an adequate response? Was it an excessive response? Were there adequate resources? Were there excessive resources? And is this the type of level of service that is needed in the community, or does it need more, or does it need less moving forward? So they were not necessarily one dependent upon the other. So I just wanted to clarify why they were recommended separately. Would you like me to? were there any, did someone have any questions on that?
Yeah, I have questions about that.
Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll go to Seth.
I'm not clear, Jason. I'm sorry. God damn it. What was I talking? I'm not clear as to what the Tompkins County Department of Emergency Response is. Is that the Sheriff's Department?
No, DEWR, the Office of Emergency Response is our department that works on countywide coordination to emergencies, whether it's through, for example, DEWR has an important role in the public health response. They have an important role in coordinating fire services, EMS services, and law enforcement services throughout the county. So they also, a component of DEWR is the dispatch center. So they fall under that purview as well.
Now, if the city transfers number 99 to the county, would they have to take all their equipment out of it?
Right. So the discussion, I think, was having the vehicle not being equipment storage, but being accessible for different types of responses, including law enforcement. So equipment movement to and from a scene would not be stored in the vehicle.
I'm talking about there's a tremendous amount of communications equipment and
that would remain in the vehicle.
Stuff that makes it usable, basically.
I think your communications equipment would remain in the vehicle. There's also some upgrading that needs to be done with the communications equipment for FirstNet communications, as well as some other upgrades, because it essentially can be functioning as a backup dispatch center if ever needed.
Right. So I guess my point is, you in an emergency, you would not have to take an hour to reload it with the gear you need.
I think depending on the type of emergency. So remember, this is a mobile vehicle. It's a communications center. That type of equipment would remain on it. I think when you're talking about something specific as law enforcement equipment, it would not necessarily be stored on it.
Yeah, like weapons and stuff.
Correct.
Finally, on this topic, does the county have a good place to store this vehicle? The city spent over $100,000 building a garage for this vehicle that kind of suits it. So does the county also have something like this?
Yes, at the DEWR facility, it's a secure fenced-in facility.
Covered?
There is a garage there, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, George. Seth.
Yeah. So I wanted to address recommendation 1 because I feel like that's the recommendation that has generated the most sort of controversy and debate. And I'll just say that I've got a lot of concerns about it. And I can say I don't think that anybody on council questions the idea that we would have a public safety response that consists of armed officers combined with unarmed, call them social workers or mental health crisis workers. And in fact, I don't think these are even new ideas. I mean, this community has initiated programs like this in the past. I mean, Dan, our chief of staff, sent around an article from 2011 about a really successful joint city and county program that was set up by Bo Saul back, I think, in the early 2000s that paired a police officer with a county mental health worker, and that they would go out in the community and respond. And it was discontinued for reasons that I don't understand. That was before my time. But a very successful program, that was done over a decade ago in this community. And we also have more recent efforts that I think have been very successful. I mean, we have the community outreach program that Tammy Baker has done such incredible work on. Also, Travis Brooks right now is overseeing the LEAD program, went out and got $1 million grant to initiate this. I think both of those are really successful efforts at doing exactly what the spirit of this plan calls for, shifting the response away from police officers, armed law enforcement, and over to social workers. And what I question is, instead of replacing the police department and renaming the police department and all of it, why don't we increase those efforts? Why don't we expand the community outreach worker program? Why don't we expand the LEAD program and shrink the police department, just hire fewer officers. I mean, you know, as the officers retire, we don't necessarily need to replace them. And the younger officers that are coming on, we can make sure that they're more in line with the city's mission. And I think it would get at the same outcome as we're seeking with this plan. You know, I also have a concern, you know, the plan calls for creating unarmed social workers that would be part of the police department or the public safety department. I think a concern I have with that is that, you know, the outreach worker program that we have right now and the lead program that we're soon to have works really well because those individuals are able to build trust with the people that they serve, precisely because they are not part of the city. They are not part of a bureaucratic response. They are not police. And I think having those individuals actually be part of a law enforcement agency could disrupt that trust. And so I have a lot of concerns with the proposal. You know, obviously I know it's generated a lot of controversy and there's been a lot of confusion and misinformation about it. You know, and more as I see, it's kind of started out, it sounded like, you know, the police department was going to be abolished and, you know, the officers were going to have to reapply and it was going to bust the union and all this stuff. Now it sounds like the officers are going to be maintained. They're still going to be considered police officers under civil service. They're not going to have to reapply for their jobs. They're still going to be able to negotiate through the PBA. I mean, this is what the mayor has communicated to us most recently in an email. And, you know, it kind of seems like we're proposing to maintain the police department in everything but name. And so I think, you know, it kind of seems to me maybe a simpler approach is just to take the programs and efforts that we've already been working on that seem to be working well, expand them, and just hire fewer officers. I mean, I don't think there's any reason why you need, you know, 4 police SUVs showing up to a routine welfare check or a mental health crisis. I mean, I think there's a lot of reform that can happen within the police department that can get us to a place where, you know, we really are fulfilling the spirit of this plan, which is to have pairing up social workers and pairing up mental health workers and unarmed social service workers with law enforcement officers.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I would say that my thoughts on that are that, and I hear what you're saying. I think it's important, though, to note that the alternative response, which you're describing with social workers and with mental health professionals, that's the alternative response, and that should continue from the outreach worker program, lead program, and whatever the county develops as that alternative response. The community solutions workers would be something different. They'd be more akin to taking on calls that don't involve, that don't require armed officers, but aren't mental health focused. So for example, to take a simple report, right, of a stolen bike or a stolen television, somebody's got to show up to take that report, to take the description of what was stolen, any information about it, and to enter it into the system. Whoever does that need not be armed, but also should have a close working relationship with the armed officers and the investigations division. I think we've witnessed before that the police department tends to stand alone. You know, they separate themselves from other agencies inside and outside the city, and getting that kind of cross-department collaboration can prove very challenging. Everything from the Gorge Ranger program to working with the DIA Ambassador program to just other agencies inside the city. And the idea being that if they're in one department, there would be a unity of mission and purpose, and the chance to build a shared culture that expands both for the armed officers and the unarmed workers, what it means to deliver public services, public safety services for the city. I think there's also a real benefit of having a director of the department that need not necessarily be a police chief, right? And there's a few practical reasons for that. I mean, we've witnessed, of course, by the time folks become police chief, they're usually vested. They've worked in a very demanding and stressful profession for 20 plus years. And retirement is an option that a lot of them choose. I think we've had 6 police chiefs in the last 20 years, maybe 7 police chiefs in the last 20 years. And the absence of that kind of consistent leadership at the head of the department, it makes it hard to see through particularly community building programming and wellness and training initiatives. I think it's also would be useful to get leadership in the department that it would be useful to be able to recruit from a broader, more diverse array of skills, people with administrative backgrounds, people who've managed complex workforces before, but may not necessarily have started their career as law enforcement officers, could still lead that department ably and could start to move those missions closer together while still, I think Seth's point is a good one, there is a need for an independent of law enforcement, force of alternative response agents, particularly trained in mental health and social work, that could do alternative response as on top of our Department of Public Safety. Jason, unless he's got his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring forward again, the purpose of Executive Order 203, specifically the tenets of it, the intent of it is to identify, to acknowledge that marginal members of communities, particularly people of color, have been negatively impacted by inequities in policing. So your strategies have to be looked through that lens. And how is that going to change the way inequities in policing has been administered in prior years? And that's an important component of it. This is, the intent was not to create alternative response models unless it's going to have a positive impact and it's going to end inequities in policing. So to George's point about the SWAT vehicle, a lot of trauma was expressed around the vehicle, particularly in marginalized members of the community, as well as people of color and communities of color in the community. So while the vehicle is an asset, the approach to it, its distribution, its use, its branding should change in order to understand and to address that negative impact. One question that came up I didn't get to, but I'll just use it as an example. The issue of traffic stops. The question about collecting demographic information with traffic stops is because generally the most common interaction with public and law enforcement for most people is probably a traffic stop. It also, you're talking about over 20 million traffic stops a year. It's also very documented and very common situation that provides for racial profiling, which leads to disproportionate contact with minorities. We don't have the information about traffic stops as to how is that impacting, what are the demographics of the traffic stops. 75% of the traffic stops resulted in warnings. Of the 25% that issued tickets, less than half of them had, more than half of them were dismissed. So the question now comes into what are the demographics of anywhere from how the traffic stop was initiated to what was the reason for the traffic stop, what was the correlation between the outcome of the traffic stop and its initial intent, and then how was it was finally adjudicated or how was it processed. All of that is talking about, is there disproportionate contact with minorities with the way we do our traffic stops? And if so, that should then lead to changes in the way we do our traffic stops. And even beg the question of, should we do traffic stops anymore? Is there a qualitative benefit to it? And if so, are we doing it the right way and should we change it? It's a little drawn out explanation. The point being is the Executive Order 203 was about and is about practices that have negatively impacted marginalized community members, particularly Black and Brown community members. That was the purpose of it. And as we look through these recommendations, we look through the lens of, are they impacting, is there going to bring positive impact to these members of our community? So I just want to refresh folks' perspective here of what the executive order was about.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because the change is, of course, difficult, and it's easy to say, well, if what we have is working well, why change it? And the question's got to be, is it working well for everyone? And I'm convinced, truly convinced, that our system has not been working well for the police officers themselves and for vulnerable communities that just don't feel like they trust our police department. They've just said that loud and clear. They don't feel like they trust it. And building that trust is means making change. And I respect the councils, will have various opinions about how far to go in the change. And it is up to council and it's up to all of us in the coming years to sort that out. But I appreciate Jason raising that point. I have Cynthia and then Donna and then George.
Actually, Donna was before me.
Oh, thank you. Donna and then Cynthia, then George.
I want to say that I now recognize the difference between 13 and 14. 13 refers to the mobile command vehicle, whereas 14 refers to the SWAT team or the people. I had been reading them both as referring to the vehicle, so I was mistaken on that part. I still might have a point about combining them, but I'm not going to belabor that now. I want to say that I think Seth made a whole lot of sense just now. And I'm grateful for that. And I think he's onto something. Not only could we have more interaction with community outreach workers and the lead people, but there might be opportunity for expanding the role of the, what are they called? Community service officers, the people who issue traffic tickets now. I mean, I think after some study, it seems like it would be reasonable to think that that kind of person could also be involved in managing crowds at the Ithaca Festival and alerting drivers of idling buses and cars parked in driveways and things like that. I mean, it seems like there's untapped potential for collaboration and expansion of roles short of the drastic measures called for in number 1 as it's currently written.
Cynthia, then George.
Yeah, thank you. I thank Jason for reminding us of the purpose of the executive order. As a minority, as a mother of Black and brown children who have to navigate this world, I fully understand and I recognize that that change needs to happen, and that the community has a breach of trust with our law enforcement. And as a result, I know that the life of officers are probably more dangerous and threatened as a result because the community is not interacting with them as fully and transparently and cooperatively as they could be. And our community is less safe as a result of that. So I applaud the overarching goal. I also very much recognize Donna and Seth's points here in that, I think what we need to make sure that the changes that we institute are meaningful. And right now they seem largely administrative, largely bureaucratic, a renaming, a realignment of titles. And what I would have liked to see more in the report is also analysis of how we ourselves as an organization are going to institute policies within the city that would create the types of results that we want to see. In addition to the LEAD program and the outreach program, implementation of annual review processes so that police officers in supervisory positions can work with officers to understand their strengths and work on their challenges and focus on the things that are being done well and the areas that we could see improvement, receiving a higher level of professionalism and performance and accountability amongst our officers. The report mentions that there is a duty to inform or a duty to report if officers who would be the most likely to be aware of improper actions within the department, that they themselves have a duty to report improper activities amongst their colleagues. But what we don't have is actually we don't have a confidential reporting system so that somebody who does report is given the protection of not being retaliated against for reporting inappropriate action. A system that makes sure that there is not only a recording process, a reporting process, but a compliance follow through to ensure that when inappropriate actions happen, that they are dealt with seriously, immediately, and effectively. And so these are things, again, within the organization itself that can be instituted without this broader restructuring, and I think are as meaningful as many of or as most, if not all, of the recommendations in here. So when I think about the structural realignment that is being proposed, I'm very confused just how all of this would be implemented. I'm not quite sure the benefit of a director over the police officer or the police chief. I look at our managerial plan, and step 12 is the fire chief and police chief. And so is it the intention that this director would be equivalent to what the police chief would be now, and then the police chief would be a step 11 underneath that director? Or are we eliminating the police chief position entirely and keeping a deputy police chief? Is there another classification? What is the benefit of that additional layer of management over the police officer who is in charge of law enforcement operations? The thing I would also like to know is we talk about in the resolution, we talk about retaining officers within the department, and then we also talk about transitioning officers within the organization. And I don't know what that means. I'd like to understand better. Does that transition mean, what is the purpose of the transition at that point? And could we elaborate on what the goals and objectives are as to why we would have a civilian director over police chief? What are the goals of the transition? What do we hope to achieve in this new structure that we don't have now?
Thank you. All good questions. So I'll say that it is a good idea to suggest added things that we can do in the department and in the city, and to add those to our plan. I think that's a good idea. I spoke just now about some of the added benefits of a director, but we can put some of those in writing too. And then the details of implementation are details of implementation. I mean, they are, with step 11, step 12, new steps to the plan, are all things that the council and community would decide together over the next couple of years, sorting out how to make that work. But the idea is that to fold together under one umbrella public safety responses, both law enforcement and non-law enforcement responses to public safety needs, all reporting to one director. And that director, not only could we recruit them from more diverse backgrounds, more diverse experiences, but again, there's a greater chance that they would have longevity, being able to lead the department for 5, 7, 10, 15 years in the same way that many of our other department heads are able to. Because the police, again, being unique amongst city agencies and that kind of turnover at the chief level. Of George and then Laura.
Thanks, Savante. I liked what you said about the non-armed officers, potentially the jobs they would do. I'm glad you made the distinction between social services type jobs, because as important as they are, I think we need to remember that that's the county's responsibility, that type of work. And given how thinly we're stretched, I don't really think we should. I think we should collaborate, but I don't think we should be hiring mental health workers and social service workers. And I appreciate what Jason said about we have to remember what this is about. And it's about gaining trust with the Black and brown community. It's also about, judging from what I've heard from a number of police officers, it's about trust between the two. And I'm not going to dispute what the commission found about Black and brown families' view of truck number 99, but and this may be before Jason's time, I've been to a lot of community picnics and events around the city where the police department brought the truck so people could go through it, so kids could go through it. And what I've seen anecdotally is people interacting with the police on a friendly, personal level during that activity. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we need more of that. But maybe we can continue to do that if it's under the county's purview. We can talk about this in more detail later, but I guess I have a question for Savante. We've talked about assuring that all the officers' jobs would be not in jeopardy. But in the language, it says, talking about the police, to the full extent of armed positions funded in said transition. So does that mean that if we have 60 police officers now, and we decide to fund 45 positions after this transition, what does that mean for those 60 officers? Does that mean 15 are out of luck, or what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I suppose that's what that would mean, but it's my understanding the council would intend to fund as many armed positions as there are current officers. That was my reading of my conversation with you and a couple other members of council.
Okay, all right. So
if you want to make that clearer in the resolution, we could do that. We take a look at language that would make that clear.
Thank you. And finally, and then I'll really will shut up.
Mm-hmm.
I think we could simplify the language of this new department in a good way by simply calling it the Public Safety Department, and call the unarmed officers public safety officers, and calling the police officers police officers.
Yeah, it's certainly simpler.
I'm done.
Thank you. I see Seth. So I actually have Laura, Graham, Rob, Seth, and Duxon.
Thank you again. And I really appreciate, in particular, I appreciate Seth's comments earlier. And in my conversations with a number of people, the draft proposal, it was the first recommendation that was the immediate topic of conversation. Conversations I've had about recommendations 2 through 19, there seemed to be general agreement that those make sense. They will bring about change, much needed change, especially change in some marginalized communities within our city and our county. And I do appreciate Jason reminding us of Jason and Savante reminding us of the goal behind the governor's executive order. I also have reservations about the first recommendation as it's written, and would like to see the police department being augmented by unarmed additional community outreach workers. There have been times where police officers that I'm aware of, police officers will work in tandem with a community outreach worker to the benefit of the situation at hand. And I'd like to be able to see a continuation and a further building of relationship between police officers, whatever they may be called, and I think we are not yet fully decided on that, and community outreach workers, social workers. I think that will benefit the community as a whole. So I'd like to see us move forward with recommendations 2 through 19, where there does seem to be a great deal of support. Talking about the resolution that was shared earlier today, I did want to ask if there would be interest in a revision of the city-specific recommendation, the first city-specific recommendation. I wonder if what I'm proposing, what I would like to suggest is that rather than create a department, I would suggest using existing data to study the creation of a department of community solutions and public safety. We can still talk about the name of that department. Others have raised that. Possibly to be led by a director who may be a civilian employee to oversee various public safety functions in the city, and report to Common Council no later than November 1, 2021, the proposed structure, staffing, and budget involved. And the reason I'm suggesting that modification is that in my mind and the minds of some people I've talked to, recommendations are being confused a bit with implementation. And this is a huge document, the proposal. The implementation is going to take a number of years. It's going to take staffing. It's going to take budgetary commitment. I'm not at all questioning those, but recognizing rather that it is going to take time and I believe further study. And so I would like to propose a revision to that first city specific recommendation in the resolution that we're looking at tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Could you send that language around to folks? Maybe it's best if we do it kind of like we do budget, which is, you know, we can create a parking lot of proposed amendments so that once it's moved, because this hasn't been moved and seconded, it's not on the floor, it's just for discussion. But if you send that language to folks, we can have it ready for the CA meeting on the 24th.
Sure, happy to. Thank you.
Next I have Graham, then Rob, then Seth, then Duxon.
Thank you, Mayor. And Laura, thanks for that. I got a bit confused about the process there because I was thinking it needed to be seconded, but I know we're not doing that. So, we all know that we've been spending a lot of time on this, and what two of the things that I'm focused on, not only from the proposals, but in talking with people, is really the best way for us to try and achieve two major objectives. One is greater accountability in public safety, and I think the other one is really a change in culture from what we have currently. And that's not, I don't think, unique to IPD. Many organizations, Cornell, the city as a whole, are going through a period where the cultures have to change. And I think that's important to recognize as we try to address the real concerns that came up. And they're very clear to me from reading, you know, the outreach that went on in terms of these two critical factors. I'm still not clear that the recommendation in terms of how you would get that with this new department is the best way forward. I mean, it's difficult to separate the idea, which I think there are many benefits to that in terms of trying to change the culture, which I accept, and I hope we can convince people that that is something that's desperately needed, with the idea of how that actually works in practice. How do you actually have police officers, armed police officers, and community solution workers, or whatever we want to call them? How do you actually get them working together? And is it the best way to have them in the same department? And I'm still concerned about the confusion that is going to come up in terms of the roles of these different types of people. Seth made a point about our existing programs, and I think the roles of those people are very clear. I think they're pretty clear to the public as well. And so I also feel that there's a lot of benefit from, as we've definitely agreed, there needs to be more effort in that area of public safety. That is I don't know, a softer response, whatever, or more kind of focused on that aspect of public safety. And I'm still having a lot of difficulty seeing how, if we did have a combined department, how that would actually work in practice. And I've been reading, I sent this note around about, other communities. I was reading about Camden. They got rid of the police department. It was only successful once there were specific kind of commitments on basically how to change the culture. That is, getting some agreement from, in this case, IPD, about what kind of changes and being specific about how they would really change, because we've heard a lot from them that, yes, they're open to change and that kind of stuff. But I think the community's been hearing that for years and nothing's really happened. And I think that's what we have to try and secure as part of this recommendation that goes forward to the state. And until I can see some specific recommendations, if we don't have this combined department, I'd be very uncomfortable about not putting something forward that achieves or aims to achieve some specific goals.
Thank you, Graham. Then I have Rob, Seth, and Duxon.
Yeah, thank you. While I have the floor, I'll just add my thanks to everyone who participated in this. It was really, for me, most striking that we had, a lot of smart and talented people involved from the city, from the county, but also from the community. And I think it was a really great effort. So I'm glad that we have this in our community. Pick up on what Graham said. I think we're probably all very much in agreement that we feel that we need to have this variety of services available for the people in our community, and that having them collaborate is really the ultimate outcome and goal. Where I'm stuck, like many of us are, is what's the best structure to facilitate that. So I really appreciate that this conversation is going on, and I'm not going to be able to add much more to it at the moment. But where I want to take my question is to try to get a little more information from you about what we can expect with, and I know you referred to it as a very rough budget estimates, but what can we expect in terms of helping us understand the financial impacts of these recommendations? And is there anything you need from us to help guide that? And how will we be able to use this over the next few weeks to be able to wrestle with this really challenging decision we need to make?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it might be one that's better answered once you see the estimates that the county's been working hard to pull together with some assist from Shelley and from Steve. And the range of estimates on recommendation 1 is going to range enormously. I mean, one thing that we can clear in our facilities master plan is that the facility most in need right now, it's number 1 on the list to be replaced, is the Ithaca Police Department. I'm talking about the building now, not the people. The building actually needs replacement. So if we were to build a new department and custom build it to this 21st century set of demands, right? If the full host of public safety and community solutions needs that we need, that's a whole different budget conversation. If we're talking about just starting with a director, start by hiring a director of public safety, change nothing else yet, but start from there and begin to grow it incrementally, that's a different set of numbers. So I think it's almost, like you said, how do we get a firmer grip on that in the next 2 weeks? I don't think we can. I think we have to decide that we're going to continue planning, continue thinking down this process, and then spend the next several months, Laura suggested through November, settling on questions like the one Cynthia raised about salary bands and working with officers themselves to figure out titles and roles and job descriptions. So it's, it's a question to say, it will be easier to know those things once we know the direction we want to go in. Is that right, Deanna and Jason? I saw you, both your cameras came on, so I assume you have something smarter than me to say.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with you. Many of these things are just a matter of will. Like Cynthia mentioned earlier, policies. So that's something that we've been talking about more intensely lately. So it's a matter of sitting down, using critical race theory, using an equity lens to think about our policies and what does that look like. And so that's folks who are it's a lot of smart people on the screen already to think about some of that work. So they're not time intensive, looking at some of the lobbying efforts. The things are, we have just a preliminary overview in terms of budget, looking at the alternative response, what that might cost, potentially looking at some of the training budget, what that might cost in relationship to some of the community solutions that were provided, the comprehensive community healing plan, looking at some of those things, the peer support model, looking at some community support in terms of potentially a community hub. So some of those things, actually, there are more recommendations that don't cost anything than do. But what we found is once folks look at it, they'll add more to it. So it'll really be, these are base level estimates in that as a taxpayer, I don't want to spend any more money than I have to. And so these are things that we have to do. And these are things that we're going to, in terms of being fiscally prudent, recognizing that with the pandemic and things of that nature, what are the things that we can say we made an investment at the same time, knowing that, again, as Jason always says, this is a beginning of the stairwell. And so what do we need to do to make sure that the folks we have on board as part of the process are successful at the same time, knowing that we'll come back to Common Council, we'll go back to the legislature as needed for the appropriate approvals and the approach as we expand the effort.
So thank you, Rob. And so, yeah, and once you see the numbers, if that triggers more in-depth questions, you let us know, and then we'll try and have answers.
So maybe just in the context of recommendation number 1, would we see a range of numbers representing different scenarios that are, because we're talking about a few different ways to structure some of the outcomes that are presented by a combination of one and other things. Is that the intent? Is the intent to give us some maybe different scenarios?
Scenarios we could do. I was going to strive for scenario, but a scenario made of modular units, right? Modular parts. So you could say, oh, if it's an X number of, geez, I'm about to embarrass myself in front of my calculus teacher and God and everybody else. But if X, Y cost, you can change X up and down. You can change Y as the unit up and down. To build our own scenarios from there. If that makes sense.
Yep, that's helpful. Thank you.
Next I have Seth, then Duxon, then Laura.
Yeah, something that George had said earlier, just had kind of triggered this for me. But one of the reasons I think I got hung up on recommendation number 1 is, just looking through the whole report and especially seeing the data that had come back from the focus groups and from the survey. You can see a sort of justification for the recommendations and the data that was gathered. And I don't necessarily know if I feel that way about recommendation number 1. And the reason is just, when you look at the focus groups, and I realize like the effort that was done in the middle of COVID, I mean, it was heroic to reach out to these groups in the city and to try to get as much feedback as possible under very difficult circumstances. But if you look at a lot of the feedback that came back, I mean, what you hear is, well, people don't trust the process. Right. And that's understandable because we've been talking about police reform for forever. And, people feel like not enough has changed. And so I understand that. But there was also seems like there was some support that I actually found surprising for the police department. I mean, there was real sympathy for the officers themselves, the stress that they're under, that they're overworked. If you look at the survey, I was actually surprised that the results of the survey were more positive about IPD in the city than I expected. And I guess that's where I sort of get hung up on this. Where did this idea come from to just wholesale replace the department and replace it with something else? Because it doesn't necessarily feel like there's a mandate for that from the data that was gathered. And, to date, nobody has quite been able to connect the dots on that one for me. And, I will say on the rest of the recommendations, there are there are recommendations in there that I think are really, really important that this community has struggled to enact in the past because there's been all kinds of pushback and everything. You know, I think about the subpoena power for the police board, for instance, is a big deal. And even, you know, no matter where we end up with recommendation 1, and I'm confident we will end up at a place where we will have consensus and vote on something. I think getting a vote on this report and a vote on these recommendations is a massive, huge achievement for this community. And, you know, I think we'll be able to get there. I know that there's going to be a lot of debate over the next few weeks, but I'm confident we're going to be able to get to a point where we will have a mandate to move forward on some changes that, you know, are going to be really good for the community. But again, I've been hung up on that recommendation number 1 for that reason. You know, I've read through the report, I've read the data from the focus groups. I don't really know where this idea came from, I guess is what I'm saying.
I have Duxon and Laura.
And I actually would like, you know, it would be good to get an answer on that one. I know that there are several members of the working group here. I mean, I'm legitimately interested. The idea for recommendation number 1, what was the genesis of it? Who came up with it? Was it vetted? Who?
Sure. So the genesis, I believe, came out of the data that showed that officers were reporting that they're responding to a lot of things that didn't require an officer response. And the community members were reporting that they didn't often feel comfortable with a militarized police response. That was the heart of it, is that the community members said they wanted a response. Officers said they were responding to too many things. I think that was the crux of where that recommendation flowed from. So that is borne out by the data, not just the community input data, but also the call data that we analyzed over the last 5 years. There was also all of the difficulty that we have in recruiting diverse people into the field right now. There was an idea that, 1, we wanted a more diverse workforce. And then the very same people we asked, you know, Black folks said they wanted to see more Black folks. Almost everybody said they wanted to see more women in law enforcement, and for good reason, it turns out. That leads to better police departments. But then those same folks, when asked, would you join the department? Would you recommend somebody you know join the department? The answer was no. So that also generated this idea of how do we create opportunities in public safety service delivery to diversify our workforce, right? Recruit people from diverse communities so that they can actually represent the diversity of our community, who aren't right now interested in signing up to becoming police officers. That's where those recommendations flowed from. It was cross-checked against some other ideas like that are being proposed across the country. So I do have Duxon and Laura. I have Cynthia. And then, because we're coming up on 7:30 and we do have a hard stop, I'll ask if Steve and Deb, who haven't weighed in yet, would like to add anything. So, but it's Duxon and Laura. And then did I see Cynthia's hand?
Thank you. So, yeah, as we move forward, I think, Samantha, you're right. We need a list of, I think we all need to make a list and just do a vote around essentially, and to get through all the amendments that we feel strongly about and make a decision, because I suspect that there will be a lot of suggestions, big and small. And I will not actually focus on recommendation number 1. I'm going to focus on everything else, in large part because over and over again, there was skepticism of the process and whether we would act on these things. And so I'm really looking at things that, you know, we transmit this to the governor on April 1st, and the first CA meeting after that, the April CA meeting, we start getting to work on it. And whether us as a body are willing to get to some of those things really quickly, and whether Savante's administration is willing to support some of them, large and small. So like the smallest, for example, is the 2 requests of New York State. Can we, you know, write resolutions real quick and get those out as soon as possible? Can we kick off the civil service exam reformation process? Transparency is a huge issue. So can we immediately start working on a new data policy? And also immediately, especially if we get assistance from the federal government, pay for that dashboard, whether it's a capital project or whether we hire someone internally to do it. I forget the other examples I was thinking of, but I have a lot of interest in moving on some of these recommendations as quickly as possible, even if it just means convening another separate working group. But I'm most interested in really living up to this idea that budgets. So my other big example was, my small example was pay for a dashboard, which we could contract out for like 100 grand or something, for example. My bigger example was, could we commit to hiring 4 more community outreach workers so that there's 24/7 coverage, whatever the number is. And that cost is really high, it's enormous. But do we defund vacant IPD positions to fund that? And that doesn't change up the structure of City Hall. It uses existing one, but it shows our commitment to these alternatives to armed law enforcement. So that's what will be on my mind coming immediately after the vote, will be stuff like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, then Cynthia.
Thank you. Yeah, Duxon said a lot of what I was planning to say, but he said it much better than I would. We've heard that the community has doubts about whether there will be real change coming from this endeavor. And I want there to be real change that is concrete. And I'd like us to be able to move quickly on some of those items that we being city and county can move quickly on. So I completely support what Duxon was just saying. Let's move ahead on some of these. The advocacy pieces we could move ahead on. One other question I had, and this is referring back to Rob's comment, a few other comments about budget. This may be a foolish question to ask, but I'll ask it anyway. The governor, this work is important work and should be done regardless of us having the executive order 203. However, we do have executive order 203. And so my silly question is, will there be any state funding to support implementation that's needed from such proposals?
Very silly.
Pie in the sky thinking, but
no, listen, it's the right question, and I think it's the one we should transmit to the state legislature and the governor, because if it's a priority for the state as well as a priority for us. So right. I think they would want to invest as well. Okay, next I have Cynthia, and then George, and then Deb.
I do have some quick suggestions to the resolution. If we could include the date when we talk about the draft report, just because, as we've all talked about, being an organic document, we should put a date to identify specifically which report we're talking about. I just want to clarify that under the recommendation or the resolution, we aren't actually revising the civil service exam ourselves, correct? We are advocating for changes to the civil service exam. So maybe that's something that we need to clear that language on. I wanted to thank the mayor for circulating the resolution. For those who are on YouTube, it is on the city site under the Agenda Center. If you haven't read it, it's there. Some questions that staff have asked me, which the resolution does articulate, I just want to say out loud for people who are watching. Under the resolution, officers will retain their jobs. They will keep their civil service status, their police status, and their benefits. There will be enough positions for everyone who is currently employed as a police officer. And finally, they will continue to operate under the current PBA contract until a new contract is negotiated. Is that correct?
Right.
For all of those items. Okay, great. Thank you.
of George, then Deb, then Steve.
Thanks, Savante. I have to say this meeting has gone very well, and I didn't think it was going to. So I'm really quite happy about that. I just want to add one last idea, and I think it says something about the quality of our police department, that this is one of their major concerns. And that is, if we have these two groups of public safety officials, police and unarmed officers, it's very, very important, absolutely crucial, that we don't separate the armed police officers even further from the community by just focusing on serious crime and et cetera. We want these officers to be more involved with the community than they are now, instead of less. So, and I think the officers want that too. So let's please remember that we don't want to create a Green Beret effect, if you will. We want all our officers involved with the community.
Next is Deb and then Steve.
Great. Most of my points have actually been made this evening. I also want to remind us that we seem to have gotten hung up on number one, but I think all of the other recommendations in the report are also quite significant, and that we need to this is a draft report that we are looking at and putting our best effort in listening to the voices of the marginalized community and really trying to make some recommendations for sweeping change, because I think one of the things that everybody can agree on, even police, is that we can't just stay status quo. We have to do something different. And it's not just a reaction to the current national backdrop. It's something that's been a long time coming. So we have to do something. We can't do nothing. I also want to, I'm concerned that some of the comments that have been made about our police, I just want to remind us it's almost like we're judging them on their worst days at this moment, right? Their mental health and their morale is currently pretty terrible. They are understaffed. They aren't able to fill shifts. We actually were relatively progressive as a legislative body when we tried to fund what we were calling the community action team, was actually something that might be able to be included as we move forward and look about what a new configuration of a police department could look like. So, and I want to reiterate a little bit of what George just said as well, which is the last thing we want to do is segment out the armed versus the unarmed. I think the spirit of 203 is to figure out how to rebuild trust and relationships and community investment on both sides. So as Jason mentioned earlier, this is we have to evaluate each of these recommendations as to will that actually get at what we are talking about, right? All that being said, I don't actually think number one is crazy. I think everything that you all have been talking about this evening is describing number one and doing it. And I want to encourage us to not toss out. We need to imagine what's possible. We need to think about this with a new frame of reference. We need to think about this with new voices that have been included at the table, voices that have not had the power and influence and that told us this is how they feel about our police. But the other side of that equation is that the police hate that people feel this way about them. So how do we connect those pieces? How do we connect both sides and get to a place in the middle where everyone is comfortable? I think where we ended up is a terrible game of semantics. I think that word replace got twisted in the wind to abolish, and it made everyone scared and uncomfortable and feel unappreciated and disrespected, and that was not the intent. So my hope is, how do we move this forward? How do we think about the spirit of number one and the elements in number one, but make sure that all of the people that are going to be looked at to create what an ideal public safety response is for our community that how do we include them at the table moving forward? How do all of these voices now intermingle in order to build that bridge to take the elements of number one that we really do need to look at and make possible? So I have one question, which is essentially, I want to understand more the role of the CJC and what that will look like, not only with regard to all of the recommendations, but is the CJC expected to assist the city in implementing some of the pieces of number one, or is the city sort of on their own to look at what a reimagined police department could look like? I guess I need more information on what you see the role and the timing and the timeline, and a little bit more about this CJC.
Right. Okay, that's a good, well, first, thank you, Doug, for saying better than I should have called on you in the first place. Very well said. And we can get you that. That's a good question about the CJC and their role as project managers. How will they assist the city? How will they assist the county? How does that break down when there's a city-only recommendation or county-only recommendation? So we'll try and get you a direct answer on that.
Thank you.
Next, Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Savante said about Deb. I think that was really eloquently said, and I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm similar to George. I'm struck by how much commonality there is in the room and how much there seems to be agreement that a lot of the fundamentals of recommendation number one need to be considered. And it seems like there's a lot of support for those things. So I'm struck and appreciative of the tone and the work that everybody here has done to get to that point. And I think, recommendation number one is kind of called attention to the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And regardless of how it got there, there are a lot of folks in our community who we owe it to have a conversation about what to do about it. And I think that's what everything I've heard, that's what recommendation number one is agreeing to have a conversation about what we're going to do at that largest scale. And I think this legislation represents the most anti-racist conversation I've seen at council. And there's so much about our work that has an impact on equality and equity and inclusion in our community. But this is by far the most comprehensive, potent conversation I've seen. And I think there's a lot to be hopeful for in all the recommendations, but I'm really supportive of having the conversation, especially around number one, because that's the one I'm getting the most questions about from both sides. And I think that's because, as Deb said, and as others have said, this is right now we have a situation that doesn't do right by certain members of our community and doesn't do right by our officers. And so having that conversation and coming up with a solution that puts our officers in a better position to do the things that they really care about and do them well and better serve our community at the same time. I think that's important. So that's all I have to say for now. No questions.
Thank you, Steve. So I'd encourage, so we've got a lot of great notes and good questions. The budget document will be coming in the next couple of days, the FAQ tomorrow as well, which should help. Let's talk about next week really quickly. So my thought, because there was confusion around this meeting, whether it would be public comment or not, and I didn't want folks to feel like they missed out on an opportunity to comment, wanted to add a public hearing next week. My first thought was Wednesday. Dan and Julie reminded me that Seth already has his hands full next Wednesday at the Planning and Economic Development Committee. It'll be a long meeting already. So I was looking at Tuesday. Tuesday, though, is the county legislature meeting night. So maybe if Jason or Dan or Dom are still on, are you expecting public comment then? Your meeting starts at 5:30, right? Sorry, you muted, Jason.
It's all right. I've only been doing this for a year, so I should know that by now.
We call that accountable around here.
Yeah, right. We have a meeting next Tuesday. Deanna, is that our public hearing as well?
Yes, it's the 16th.
Okay, it is. Now, I will say that, so we have our public hearing on Tuesday. There's a public safety meeting on Thursday, next Thursday, which would be the 18th. And then we have another public safety committee meeting the 23rd. That's a special, so that's a special public safety committee meeting. And I believe the legislature is expecting to have, most legislators, I think all legislators will be attending the public safety committee meeting on the 18th as well as the 23rd. And then I believe they're having a special ledge meeting on the 30th to take action. So our public hearing is on Tuesday. It would be at 5:30, which would be the start of it.
It'd be at 5:30. Do you think if we scheduled our public hearing at 7, it would be clear enough if anybody wanted to attend both? They could do the county one and then come to the city one?
I mean, it's an hour and a half later. It's possible. I mean, we usually have the public hearings is usually before any business takes place. So it would be before anything like privilege of the floor or anything along those lines. It would all be before that. It would be the actual first thing that happens.
Okay. Is council comfortable with that Tuesday at 7 o'clock, recognizing that that would be just one of a series of more public comment sessions?
Yes, and I suspect that there's not as much overlap, especially if there's a lot of law enforcement who want to speak to those IPD officers.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all. It is 7:30, so thank you. Really appreciate the good discussion, the back and forth, the suggested edits, and yes, if there are proposed amendments that people would like, you could send those ahead of time as well, so we can create I think Dixon called it a vote-around. Yes, Deb.
I also just want to know if there are other people that people want to hear from. We can think about who we might want to invite to city administration. If there are additional questions from council that you want to, maybe we want to hear from Shelley about some HR implications or whatnot. So if there are people who you would like added to the agenda for CA, you can also let me know that as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, is there a motion to adjourn? Moved by Graham. Is there a second? Second by Steve. All those in favor? And that carried unanimously. Oh, you did it again. And you're in opposite corners. All right.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.